Your first lab is going to help you get started using P5. And this is a really great tool. It's an open source library is one way to look at it. It's a JavaScript library, but it also includes an editor so you can work directly in the browser. And I think one of the greatest things about this P5 site is that it was developed in order to help teach programming in a different way. Usually I think artists struggle with learning programming because it doesn't seem very visual. A lot of times you have to type a lot of code before you actually see anything occur, and it just feels frustrating to learn. But this site's really nice. It's developed for artists, designers, educators, and you are learning JavaScript. So you're going to be learning a lot about the syntax, how JavaScript works to create interactivity. But at the same time, I think you'll enjoy this because it has kind of an immediacy, and it's going to be very visual. We're going to be working with drawing and interactivity in your project. So the very first lab is just about learning to sign in, getting started, and creating your first sketch, we'll call it, using P5 code right in their editor. I want to point out that you should have already set up a GitHub account, and some of you might have already had one in the past. And then if that's so, just send me your URL, just copy and paste that. But if you haven't used this before, GitHub is a really popular location to store files. It's a repository of files. A lot of people share files with each other. So it's very popular with the programming community. So if you haven't used it before, go ahead and set up that GitHub account, and then you can at least take a minute and set up your profile. It's fine if you don't have any files published yet, but for today, maybe at least set up an image, nickname. You can edit your profile here, set up some information if you like, and then you're set to go. And I'm going to go back to P5 because I am going to have you log in using your GitHub identity, by the way. So I just want to double check you had set up that first. And then I think the easiest way to handle the first lab is just go directly to p5js.org and then scroll down to this little getting started section. And they have a good introduction that's very easy. You can click the get started page, and it has directions that I think are very clear if you want to start to follow them. They also have a link right here to the PS editor. So this will take you over and pop open a new window. So it looks somewhat like this, where there's a coding window on the left, and you're going to be able to preview on the right. By the way, you do click this preview button after you start to add code to see what happens on the right. And you can leave auto refresh turned on so that actually you don't have to click preview constantly to see things happen as you work. So at this stage, the editor's open with some default starting code. And we can refer to these as functions. And they always give you 2 as a default in P5. Setup is really designed to kind of like it's stated to set up some of the basic things like the size of the working area. Create canvas is also a function, and it has parameters where you can enter in dimensions for the width and height of your screen size or canvas area. And then the second function they're giving you by default is called draw, and you're going to work inside of it to specify objects, text, and other elements. So you're going to create the drawing in this area. Now what you can do is, once that editor's open, you can go back to that getting started page, and I want you to start to follow this yourself. So it tells you a little bit about the beginning code, and your first step is going to be to create a circle. So you're going to be adding the ellipse function, and then in parentheses you'll start to enter in values. And still to get used to this environment, I do want you to read this yourself. I wanted you to get used to using the documentation along with my recorded lectures, so you can kind of walk through this. It starts with creating a circle, by the way, and then it moves down into having you copy and paste code that makes it more interactive, where it's actually sensing where the mouse cursor is. And I think that starts to show you a little bit of the excitement of where we're headed. This first week in labs are really focused on just how do you create primitive objects, but then we're going to move into making them interactive so that we can create a project where your program that you're creating is actually responding to user input, like a click or hitting a keyboard. But I think a good way to build up our knowledge is just to start the first week with how do you create objects like text or shapes and alter things like color and appearance. So this very first one, this, if you follow this, get it started, I think really should only take you maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20, if you want to play with it a little bit more, experiment more with it. And once you're finished with it, I'm going to have you submit the URL of your sketch. And let me go back over the editor. And I want to also point out that as you're doing this Getting Started lab and any of the other labs that you'll do, you want to make sure you're signing in to save your work. So I want to just point that out. I mentioned I wanted to have you set up the GitHub account first, and then you're going to actually sign in with that. So for example, when I'm in this editor window, in the right-hand corner, I see log in or sign up. So the very first time you'll be hitting sign up, and I can click log in at this stage because I've already used it. And I'm going to encourage you to log in with GitHub. I think it will make it more convenient to connect the two and potentially save files like images later on GitHub itself. So instead of using something like your email or a new password, again, look for the login with GitHub. And at this stage, I'm back in that editor window. But if I look in the right-hand corner, I can see my GitHub name, Diane Ninja, there. So I can tell that I'm logged in. And I also want to point out that you can click the My Account drop-down. And this is where I go to navigate and look at files I've created earlier. So for example, I can click My Sketches, and I can start to see other projects and things that we're going to create. And I think that's not obvious how to navigate. So I want to just go back there that under My Account, you can move around and work on sketches, open things that you've created. And you guys are going to be right at square one. Again, we're kind of following the Get Started page, try out their first sketch, experiment with it. And then the other thing I want to try right at the beginning is getting used to how they're organizing examples, learn, libraries, reference. I'm going to kind of point at these main menu items in the sidebar. So for example, reference, I think, is one of the best places to go to really understand these functions or code that you're adding. So you can start to see how they're organized. And the second lab you're going to work on is going to build on creating other shapes and controlling things like color. So just for example, I can look over here and see things like the ellipse function that's included in the Getting Started lab to create a circle. So if you're in reference, I think this is the best place to click on their functions and get really good information on them. They're kind of short description of what it does. Like this says ellipse draws an ellipse to the screen. And then they explain what your possible parameters are. And when we're using these, I think you're seeing that you're entering the function name, ellipse, and then parentheses that follow it. So we call these arguments when you type in certain values. But another way to phrase it is that the function is created with parameters you're allowed to vary. So this is trying to explain that the first two parameters that you can work with are specifying width and height. And I feel like if you get used to looking at this reference area, you're getting the best description of each function. So again, you can start to go in here and say, maybe I want to create a rectangle. And you could find that under shapes, click rectangle, and start to see what the code looks like as an example. And then go down and look at the description and the information about the parameters. So if you get used to reference, I think you can really do a lot on your own. Learn and examples are similar, but they're showing you kind of like putting the pieces together, bigger examples. Like you can go over to overview or some of these other topics on your own and see an example and start to read about it. I look at reference as breaking it down more by individual functions or pieces of code. But to get a better idea of like how you put these things together or what they can do, I think looking at both learn and examples will be helpful to get you oriented. So in this first lab, again, try to go back to reference on your own and see if you can locate any of the functions that are mentioned in that first lab and start to look them up on your own and try to have fun with it. This first lab again should take I think 15-20 minutes, and then I'm going to have you do a second lab that's kind of a drawing where you're going to explore creating more shapes, color, more of the visual attributes that we can control with P5 and JavaScript.